Pánové, teď by měla následovat diskuze. Já poprosím každého, kdo by chtěl vznést otázku, aby se přihlásil a šel sem na toto místo, kde stojím, k mikrofonu. Jde zejména tedy o překlad té otázky, aby se představil a otázku položil. Takže vyzývám vás, kdo chce položit první otázku. Prosím, pojďte.
Dobrý večer, jmenuji se Národní klub. Především bych chtěl poděkovat za precizní obraz doby tohoto absurdního světa, respektive absurdní obraz, který zde byl precizně vlíčen. Není to všem nic šokujícího, každý rozumný člověk tyto symptomy pozoruje pouhým okem během posledního 10 let minimálně. Otázka a těžká odpověď je, co je zatím. Nechci se věřit, že by to byla pouhá nedostatečnost a stupidita západních elit. Tedy, co nutí západní elity postupovat v tomto absurdním směrem a jaké jsou cíle těchto tendencí. Děkuji.
Well, I think the answer to that is also quite simple. I think that they are driven partly by ideology, but mainly by financial interest. I think that it's not a secret for anybody, is it, that the process of globalization has profited banks, the financial sector particularly, in a gigantic way. The reduction of regulation, the reduction of national regulation, and also international regulation has been one of the contributing factors to the massive increase of the financial sector. It's also an advantage to multinational corporations. The American arms manufacturers wield a very decisive influence over American foreign policy making, and that's another contributory factor, particularly when you are trying to set up yourself as a global hegemon and as a global policeman. You need to have a lot of arms to do that. So I think that ideology is in the service of financial interest, and I think that multinational companies, international banks, work together with these international organizations to push ahead regulatory regimes which serve their purposes. That is to say, they push ahead on supranational regimes which they can lobby, which they can have a greater influence in lobbying, because it makes their business more profitable. So I think that's the answer as to why.
Poprosím další dotaz, prosím.
I'm Amit Jedlička. I'm from organization. Hello. Formit.cz. I quite like your speech, but let me disagree with you on approach to free market, which could possibly insult some libertarians who are going to watch your speech. I think that the free market is probably the most hated word in European Parliament. I don't think that you would disagree with me on that. And I think that you can remember that even Mr. Sarkozy mentioned that he wants to remove free market from the Lisbon Treaty and replace it with common market instead, which is a rather corporativist a /fascist phrase. You can also see that the common market is heavily regulated and is going to favor corporations who are in favor of European integration. And I would say that Maoists are anything but free market advocates. Free market economists like Adam Smith or Frederick Bastiat have been always on the right side of the political spectrum. And I think that countries can fully enjoy free market and free trade without interfering with each other's sovereignty. So I think that your argument that free market advocates are helping to promote leftist agenda of world government is undefendable. Communists might say that they oppose state and they support free market, but in practice they do exactly the opposite. On the other hand, it is more than clear that neoconservatism that is driving the New World Order agenda of unjust wars in Iraq, Libya, and Serbia are products of Trotsky's concept of permanent democratic revolution, which is embodied in the neoconservative movement itself. To conclude, I want to ask you a question: what is wrong with the free market and free trade if it's really free? Can I oppose the concept of national socialist state as well as the concept of global government? To me, communist national government is almost as bad as global communist government. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that excellent question. I'm not sure that we do disagree. Firstly, I think that my point is that leftists and globalists have hijacked the notion of the free market in order to pursue the globalist agenda. I think there is a conceptual difference between somebody who wants to see, as I do, a reduction in the role of the state and a regime based on law. There's a difference between that on the one hand and the promotion of supranational bodies with power whose goal is to police a supranational market. No doubt the word free market is wrong, but they want to promote a supranational or even international market, and they want to police it. I'm referring to the European Commission and to the World Trade Organization. You say that there's no dirtier word than free market. I know what you mean, but the fact remains that the European Union has used the single market program to increase its own power. And just as the World Trade Organization has done at the international level. So I think that we need to distinguish conceptually between a classical free market regime of the kind that Adam Smith and Frederick Bastiat argued for, whereby states would agree with each other to lower tariffs and trade as much as they could. We need to distinguish that from what we in fact have, which is a world market governed by rules which are decided at international level by international organizations like the European Commission and the World Trade Organization. Because that kind of, I agree it shouldn't be called free market, but that kind of globalism is clearly contains a political component. There is political power involved here, and I do think that it favours large enterprises, multinational organisations and banks over the, in my view, more, shall we say, real parts of the economy. I think there has been an unfortunate hijacking of the doctrine of the free market in favour of something which really bears no resemblance at all to what Adam Smith or other liberals would have called for. Of my own personal view on this, having made that distinction, is that there is we can talk about this maybe later, but there is, with free market liberals, an excessive concentration on free trade. That's my own personal view. And that's why I say that this ideology of free trade is hijacked in a globalist cause. Because I personally don't see why labour should be taxed, as it is, at 30 or 40%, but trade taxed at 0 or 2%. I don't see what liberal principles make it an article of dogma that international trade should be taxed at 0 or at very low rates, while labour is taxed at such a high rate. That seems to me to be a distortion in the economy, and one which, as I say, is justified in the name of globalist ideology. When you tax something, you make it more expensive. And if you make something more expensive, it costs more, so there'll be less of it. If you tax labour as high as we do, you make labour more expensive, and that's why there are fewer jobs to go around. That's why there is unemployment. If you cut taxes on imports and make them cheaper, there will be more imports. I think there is a policy choice to be made about what level imports and exports should be taxed, or imports anyway should be taxed on. And I don't see that a liberal should necessarily have a problem with that. I think that the overall reduction of tax is a good thing, and I think that one of the weaknesses of the liberal argument in recent years has been precisely to emphasise literally tax on trade at the exclusion of everything else. And that's why I say the doctrine of the free market has unfortunately been hijacked in favour of the creation of supranational political bodies who are globalist or proto-globalist.
Další otázka, prosím.
Velice stručně. To už jsem se zachytil někde.
Mé jméno je Skácel a dovolím si položit hned otázky 2. První otázka, ta je trochu prognostická, jaký bude vývoj v současném evropském společenství v Evropské unii s ohledem na krizi v eurozóně a jak to bude pokračovat. A otázka číslo 2. Hovořil jste neustále o obrovském vlivu finančního kapitálu. Protože jste zde citoval Marxe, pokud se týče komunistického manifestu, já bych si dovolil ocitovat jednu z posledních vět Marxova Kapitálu, kdy říká, že konec kapitalismu nebo závěrečná epocha kapitalismu bude spočívat v tom, že finanční kapitál pohltí kapitál průmyslový. Beru to se schéma dělení Marxe, který dělil kapitál na průmyslový, obchodní a finanční. Děkuji.
Well, in answer to your first question, how do I see the development of the EU in the light of the crisis? Of course, I think that the EU and the euro will break up. However, if I could tell you when it would break up, I would be a richer man than I am. I thought it was going to break up this year, but that was to confuse my hope with analysis. It seems to me that the situation is untenable and that it will at some point break down. On the other hand, I am firmly convinced that we in Europe, and I mean all European states, are governed, and I'm using my words very carefully, by one single political class. I repeat, by one single political class, by a body of people, a power structure, a body of people who see each other a lot, who interact at the personal and at the institutional level, and who have a massive self-interest, both personal and institutional, in keeping the system going. And that is why, when he came to speak to us in Paris in April, Václav Klaus said that he was convinced that the European political class, I quote, would do anything, and I repeat, anything, that's Klaus speaking, to keep the euro together. I was talking to a French politician on Saturday who spent his summer holidays in Greece. He described a situation of unimaginable economic devastation in Greece. People begging in the streets, medicines not being provided in hospitals, pensioners not being able to make their pension last for the end of the month, and so on. I think we are seeing really in this Greek crisis the hard end of a very dangerous ideology. But I repeat, the European political class, and when you experience it up close, as I did in October when I attended the Congress of the European People's Party, you see that this is a real power structure. It's a homogenous political class. Between left and right there is effectively no difference, and it will do everything to keep the thing going. As for your second question about financial capital and industrial capital, I'm not a Marxist. I've never been a Marxist. But one has to admit that on this point, Marx was prophetic. I would add, however, an important qualification. I hope this will please Mr. Yetichka. While it is true that the financial sector is, as it were, devouring the industrial sector, and while it is true that virtual economics has expanded at the expense of real economics, finance at the expense of industry production, one of the root causes of the immense increase in the financial industry over the last 30 years or so is the underlying disorder in the monetary system created by the fact that we have only paper currencies in the world since 1971, since the Americans broke the last link to gold. This is an absurd situation. And like the euro, it is a situation which cannot last. The reason why there is so much one of the reasons why there is so much financial speculation is that there is an underlying instability in the monetary system itself. You can't blame the banks for trying to speculate about an underlying instability which exists in the monetary system itself. Blaming the banks is like shooting the messenger. And incidentally, this is one of the reasons why the discourse about free trade is so dishonest. Because to come back again to Adam Smith and Frédéric Bastiat, they would never have advocated a worldwide free trade system in the presence of paper currencies fluctuating in value against each other. When Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, trade was conducted effectively in gold. The monetary world that we live in now is an aberration. It means that states, or in the case of the European Union, a superstate, have taken over control of the production of money, just as in the communist system, the state took over the production of steel. It's exactly the same situation, only much worse, because of course the currency is the foundation stone of the whole economy. And we're in this unbelievable situation where the state or the central bank tries to decide how much money there should be in the economy. It's crazy. How much steel should there be in the economy? How many cars should there be in the economy? How much food should there be in the economy? Those questions should be answered by the market, not by the state. And so, I repeat, this underlying problem of financial instability and incidentally of debt, because of course to suspend the convertibility of your currency into gold is to produce unlimited debt in the form of paper currency, which is never redeemed. The currency, a banknote is after all a debt instrument, a tradable debt instrument. To issue unlimited notes, promises to pay, with no intention of ever paying them back. You can't take your Czech crowns to the Czech central bank and get gold. You can't take your euros to the European central bank and get gold. These banknotes, these currencies, are themselves expressions of debt which nobody intends to repay. Well, in those circumstances, it's no surprise if states run up huge amounts of debt. The French budget has not been balanced since 1975. All states run constant budget deficits and they pay off old debt with new. So this is one of the root causes of the problems that we're in.
Já jsem si to radši napsal, abych vám něco důležitého nezapomněl. Já jsem Vladislav Zemánek, hrdý signatář manifestu D.O.S.T. Pan Laughland řekl, že v Rusku započal pozitivní vývoj, který je nezatížený ideologií a který je příznivý tradičním konzervativním hodnotám, jako je víra, vlastenectví a podobně. Dokážete posoudit, do jaké míry zůstane tento proces omezen na samotné Rusko, či do jaké míry podnítit takový pozitivní vývoj v dalších zemích, zejména těch slovanských? Jinými slovy, může se ruské národní obrození, když se to řekne trochu nadneseně, stát základem k jakémusi novodobému slavianofilství u slovanských, případně i dalších národů? Možná by se tak začala naplňovat velká úloha, jakou slovanstvu přisoudil německý filozof Herder. Může tedy Evropský východ přispět k restauraci tradice v Evropě? Děkuji.
I don't want to idealize Russia or overstate the case. Russia is a country with very considerable problems, which its leadership is well aware. But I don't think anyone can deny what the trends are. There's no denying, I think, that there has been a certain amount of national, patriotic and religious reconstruction. Will it be a model? I hope so. But not because I think that the Russians can save us, or because they are somehow civilizationally superior, but instead because their experience is something that we can learn from, and above all because what they have learned is reality. They have simply learned reality. They have come up, they have been faced with reality. They have been faced with the reality of the collapse of the state. And that is why the process of national reconstruction was undertaken, because the collapse of the state was really terrible in economic and in social and in many other ways. It was a catastrophe. Look at all the figures for the 1990s, they were a catastrophe. You're asking me, though, about a specifically Slav element. That's for you to answer. Of course, there are some Slav nations where the national issue is on the agenda. I'm thinking of the Serbs, principally. Whether the Serbs will be able to undertake that process, I have my doubts. They, for the reasons that we all know, have been terribly weakened, and really they've been on their knees now for basically 20 years. The Czechs, yes. I would think that the Czechs could very easily start to undertake such a process. You are unique in having Klaus as a president and in having around him groups like this one and thinkers who basically share his analysis of the problem. But whether it extends to other Slav nations, it's difficult to say. The concept of Slav unity has never really worked. Particularly when you recall that the Poles are obviously Slavs. And as we know, between Poland and Russia, it has been more exactly what the Croats are actually, although, as you know, there is some claim by certain Croats that they are in fact non-Slavic. Anyway, I think that each nation retains its particular characteristics. I'm reluctant to say that there is a Slav identity beyond, in any political sense. Of course there's a Slav identity, of course there are things in common, but there are at the European level as well. But I don't think that those are what make the difference in politics. I think what makes the difference in politics is nation states. Obviously the Slav world is divided into nation states like the Latin world and the European world in general.
Já bych se zeptal, můžu dva dotazy. První otázka, jak byste charakterizoval z ideologického hlediska ex-prezidenta Václava Havla, o marxismu. A druhá otázka je ohledně vlastně boje Evropské unie proti nacionalismu, proti státu. Tak bych tady jako protiargument použil to, o čem hovoří Nigel Farage. Hovoří o tom, že vlastně řada eurofilů, eurokratů se snaží vytvořit evropský nacionalismus, EU nationalism. A s tím koresponduje snaha jako oslavovat Den Evropy, mít hymnu Evropské unie, mít společnou měnu, společnou vlajku. A s tím souvisí to, že vlastně jakoby třeba Němci, kteří jsou frustrováni zkušeností druhé světové války, tak jakoby vyměnili svou národní identitu za tu evropskou, jakoby v pozorkách národní identitu. Čili tady to připomínka, jestli vlastně tu není snaha vytvořit ten evropský nacionalismus s těmi atributy, jaké náleží národnímu státu, jako je vlajka a tak dále, jak jsem to zmínil.
Well, as far as Havel is concerned, I've already said, I think, in my talk that he is a pure product of the 1960s, or was. When I've referred to Marxism, I'm using in discussing these phenomena, I'm using the term Marxism in the broadest possible sense. I've no idea whether Václav Havel was ever, I don't know, he probably was interested in Marx, I don't know. But he is more, I think, a phenomenon of the 1960s. In other words, he is interested in the postmodern society, post-nationalism, the end of national sovereignty, and for all I know, a very postmodern view about the family and traditional social structures, to put it mildly. So he is a sort of cultural Bolshevik, if you like. You asked me about nationalism in Europe. Obviously, you asked about nationalism in Europe. Yes, the attempt is there to create a European identity with a flag, an anthem, and all the rest of it. It's absolutely pathetic. It is pathetic. On the banknotes of the euro, as you know, they have designed bridges and windows, bridges to symbolize connection with other people, windows to symbolize openness. These windows and these bridges on the banknotes do not exist anywhere. They are invented. What could be a more perfect illustration of the artificial and abstract nature of this so-called identity? It's a pure invention. I mean, good God, it wouldn't have been that difficult to agree on a number of European historical figures who could have gone on the banknotes. We could have had Mozart, we could have had Leonardo da Vinci, we could have had Shakespeare. That's not very difficult. But no, they decided instead to invent bridges and windows which don't exist. In the same way, when they sing the anthem, I heard the European anthem being sung at the European People's Party Congress in Bucharest in October. Do you know what they do? They stand there as the Ode to Joy is played with their mouths shut. They don't sing. Because how could they possibly all sing in 29 or 27 different languages? Again, it is pure kitsch. The reality is quite the opposite of this kitsch. Just as in the Soviet Union we heard about the friendship of peoples and so on, and we know that that was a lot of rubbish. So, of course, we see very clearly that the euro crisis has exacerbated national tensions. That's obvious to everybody. No honest person can deny it. There are always caricatures of Mrs. Merkel dressed up in a Nazi uniform in Greece, while the Germans think the Greeks are a bunch of lazy thieves. Where is the national unity in that? Where is the European unity in that? The euro has precisely made the members of the eurozone more unsatisfied with each other than they were before. So that's why I'm convinced the process will at some point break down.
Good evening, my name is Alish and I'm a student at Charles University. I have a question concerning the so-called Russian national revival. As I gathered from your speech, you consider moderate patriotism or moderate nationalism a positive value. Isn't there a conflict then between, for example, Baltic nationalism and Russian nationalism? And isn't it a possible source of conflict in Europe? Because that's probably what makes the Baltic countries one of the most pro-EU countries. It's their historic experience with Russia.
Well, I'm glad you asked that because it was my final point, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to develop my thought on it. It's precisely my claim this evening that the victory of the left, the intellectual victory of the left, can be seen in our assumption that the Soviet experience was an exclusively Russian phenomenon. So exactly as you have asked the question, you have the Baltic states on one side and the Russians on the other. I don't believe that that analysis corresponds to reality. Yes, there is a conflict. I'm not trying to deny that. But I think that that analysis does not correspond to reality. Why do I say that? I repeat, firstly because the Soviet Union and communism generally was not an exclusively Russian phenomenon. Secondly, as it happens, the Latvians played a very considerable role in the Bolshevik Revolution. The Latvian riflemen, there were statues of the Latvian riflemen all over the Soviet Union. They were one of the largest national groups, in fact, in the early Bolshevik Party, because Latvia was the most industrial part of the Soviet Union. So when the Balts now say that, or pretend that there were these brave little peoples standing out against the Russian imperialist monster, I'm afraid that does not correspond to the reality. The reality is that the Baltic states were annexed into the Soviet Union, and that the inhabitants of the Baltic states became Soviet citizens on an equivalent legal basis to the Russians. And the Russians suffered from communism as much, if not more, than the other republics of the Soviet Union. So I think it is essential to break free of this revisionist view of communism. Yes, there was a geopolitical element to the Soviet Union, obviously, and yes, it had some elements in common with Russian statehood, but you cannot, it is, in my view, quite unacceptable for the Baltic states, and frankly for other members of the Warsaw Pact, to behave as if there had been no Baltic communists, no Baltic pro-Soviet people, no Baltic or Czech or Polish communists, as if the communist system was invented out of nothing in these countries. There are very few countries in which it was invented out of nothing. There are some, but there are very few. And in the case of the Baltic states, there is a particularly unpleasant phenomenon which I think should be mentioned. And that is the way in which their nationalist reinterpretation of Soviet history has led to apologies for Nazism. There is a very strong revisionist tendency, particularly in Latvia, but also in Estonia, and to some extent in Lithuania, which presents the SS, the Waffen-SS legions, again, particularly in Latvia, but also in Estonia, as having been patriots fighting for the independence of their countries. There are memorials. There's a memorial that's just been put up in Latvia to the police battalions who allegedly defended their town from the Soviet invasion in 1944. These people were Nazis. They were Nazis. They were Nazis fighting for the Nazis. Now, there is no other part of Europe in which there are monuments going up or ceremonies in honor of the memory of Nazis. And this, I think, is the extreme point of a very widespread view. It's an officially promoted view now that the Baltic states were subject to Soviet occupation. I'm speaking about this tomorrow. The Baltic states were not occupied by the Soviet Union. The Baltic states were annexed by the Soviet Union. That is to say, they became part of the Soviet Union, which means that the Balts became Soviet citizens, and that the Soviet system, which the Soviet leaders believed, or at least claimed to believe, was the most progressive form of government, and the form of government that would soon be extended to the whole world, was extended to the Balts. They were treated on an equal level to other Soviet citizens. And this officially supported now, a doctrine of occupation, is historically untrue, and it serves the purpose of giving legitimacy to a new, as you say in your question, pro-European, pro-American elite. But I'm afraid it is not based on historical truth.
Večer, dámy a pánové, já se jmenuji Daniel Solis z Vysoké školy mezinárodní veřejný stav v Praze. Asi se ptám česky. Mě v té vaší rovnici, která vůbec vlastně obepíná celý svět, chybí dva malé elementy. Zdánlivě tedy malé elementy, že mě zajímalo, jak vidíte na hraně toho kontextu zejména současnou roli napětí mezi islámskými sektami, jako jsou šíité a sunité, v současné geopolitické situaci, která se dotýká Ruské federace a její role ve světové politice, a jak do toho měnového konceptu, který jste zmiňoval, taktéž by zapadala Čína, podle vašeho názoru. Jestli to není úplně mimo kontext, ale dovolíte mi tuto otázku odpovědět.
Well, I talk about a lot of subjects I'm not expert on. I'm a little hesitant to talk about the Sunni-Shia conflict because it really is something I don't know a great deal about. I mean, I don't know how much we want to discuss it. I think various things. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why it would make sense for us to have closer relations, or at least friendly relations with Russia, is that we in Europe, in the larger sense, are of course faced with a Muslim world which is energetic and whose power, at least demographically, is rising. We in the European continent, by contrast, seem to be spiritually slowing down and demographically slowing down. But I think you were asking me more about the Shia-Sunni conflict in particular.
So you mentioned Syria.
Oh, in Syria. Well, I do think that the Syrian crisis can be explained to some extent by a desire by the Americans to play the Sunnis and the Shias off against each other. The invasion of Iraq, as you know, led to the overthrow of the Sunni regime there, and therefore to the de facto creation of a pro-Iranian Shiite state in Iraq. And to some extent, I think we can see the current attack on Syria as an attempt to compensate for that policy consequence. Because, of course, Syria is a pro-Iranian and pro-Iranian state, and one which is governed by a Shiite sect. So the destruction of Syria would, as it were, or the overthrow of the regime in Syria would, as it were, compensate for the increase of Iranian power in Iraq. And in any case, I think that the attack on Syria is motivated by a desire to reduce and isolate, to reduce the role of Iran and to isolate it. But I'm not an expert on, I write about these things, but the thing I wanted to emphasize in my talk was the international law aspect, because I am a strong opponent of humanitarian intervention. I have been ever since the Kosovo War. I think it is a hypocritical policy. I think it's a warmongering policy. I think intervention very often makes things worse it can make conflicts worse. I think the intervention in Bosnia made the conflict worse. I think that intervention can produce a vicious circle of more intervention, and I think we're seeing that in Syria. Iran has said it will defend Syria if Syria is attacked. So we can see in Syria the same process that we observed in the Spanish Civil War, when the Frente Popular in Spain appealed to the Front Populaire in France for help. The Léon Blum replied positively and started to send weapons and money to Madrid. And it was at that point that Franco said, I've got to get help from somewhere. And he first went to Mussolini and then to Hitler. So this is an example of how intervention can create a spiral. And that's what's happening in Syria. And that's why when the Charter of the United Nations was drawn up, it quite explicitly ruled against intervention. There is no right to intervention in the internal affairs of states in the United Nations Charter. And many resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, have confirmed a strict adherence to the principles of non-intervention. This is one of my favourite subjects. I believe that intervention is bad, I believe that it's illegal, and I believe that it should be restored as a principle of international relations. And for the time being, Russia and China are standing up for non-intervention. They are standing up for classical international law and for the international law of the United Nations. What do you want to ask me about China?
Well, there are rumors about the gold standard, in fact.
I think we're a long way from, well, it's difficult to say sometimes, isn't it? Who would have said, what would we have said about communism in January 1989? I remember seeing something in a German border in January 1989. Who would have thought it was to disappear before the end of that year? Things can go faster than one imagines. Unfortunately, I think that the return to gold is some way off, because monetary theory has been ideologically poisoned by monetarism, by the theory known as monetarism. When I said earlier, the state decides how much money there should be, that is the ideology known as monetarism. That's Milton Friedman's ideology. It's completely crazy, but it has a very powerful hold over states and over policymakers, not least because it gives them an immense power over the economy. So if there were to be a return to real money, perhaps it would have to take place spontaneously. Perhaps people will start asking for payment in gold. Perhaps gold will start to be used as a method, as a means of international commerce. Perhaps, for example, oil will start to be sold at a gold price. It's not impossible, but I think we're some way off from states understanding how they need to restructure the monetary system, and that makes me sad, because I think ultimately that states need to take control of this. The states do have a role as the providers of order.
John, in the context of your talk, how do you understand the phenomenon of Václav Klaus? You've met him today, you've met him a couple of times before. And he is definitely a person who is hated by the single political class that you were speaking about in Europe, but on the global scale, whenever he goes to one of these conferences, fewer and fewer of politicians are associating with him. They are scared to death to be photographed, to be on a picture with him, standing somewhere discussing things. So how do you explain that? How can someone like him achieve the role that he plays? And speaking about his role, do you see any role for him in the future?
Well, I think the fact that he is treated in the way that you describe is quite simply a proof of what one might call the closing of the European mind. You'll remember Alan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind. We can observe the same closing. We can observe the same inexorable reduction of the permitted margin of political discourse. Fewer and fewer subjects are up for discussion. None of the great issues are up for debate. EU, NATO, free market, social protection, even societal issues like even societal issues like gay marriage are not really subjects for major political confrontation or even discussion. There's a sort of postmodern lassitude, really, that seems to have engulfed everyone. And this goes together with an incredible lack of courage. It's sort of preemptive suicide. Václav Klaus told me a story this morning about Viktor Orban. I don't know, maybe it was told in confidence, so I shouldn't repeat it. But the gist of the story is that Viktor Orban was nervous about, as you say, having been next to Klaus at a conference and having agreed with him. Well, Viktor Orban is famous for having been the first Hungarian politician to call for the Soviet troops to leave Hungary. When he made this speech on Hero Square in Budapest, it was regarded as incredibly courageous. Well, if someone who can tell the Red Army to go home can't tell the European Union to go home, that really does show the situation that we've got into. Does he have a future? I think his future is clear. I think it is to act as a figurehead for sensible, realistic European policy at the European level. I don't imagine him re-entering Czech politics, but he is, of course, very well known across Europe and respected in spite of, respected by his friends, and of course not respected by his enemies, but he is respected by a lot of people. I think it's a natural progression for a former head of state, and I think he has another advantage apart from his own personal qualities, which are considerable, which is that he comes from a small or medium-sized state. If he were to enter European politics in even in some symbolic way, as the patron of a European-wide movement, I think the fact that he does not come from a big state is very useful. It's just tactically very useful. It's quite difficult for leaders of big states to have a European role. Tony Blair wanted to become the president of the European Council. He didn't get the job because they went to Belgium instead. It's difficult to imagine Angela Merkel, when she ceases to be Chancellor, having a European role. These kinds of international roles are fulfilled typically by people from smaller countries, Belgium, Scandinavia, and so on. So I think he has all the qualities for that kind of activity. And quite frankly, as Victor Hugo said, there is nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And everybody can see that the euro is leading us into a catastrophe. That European federalism and post-nationalism cannot work, and that some kind of sensible way has to be found out of this mess.
Nějaký dotaz?
Zimová, dobrý večer. Děkuji velmi za vaši přednášku. Otevřela mě osobně další dvířka uvažování. Chtěla bych se zeptat na následující věc. Tady se hovořilo o tom, že Německo tím, že staví na dramatech z války vůči vlasti jako takové, že se identifikuje lehčeji s Evropskou unii, s tou myšlenkou té jednotné Evropy jako vlasti všech Evropanů na tomto území žijící. Já si chci zeptat, jestli takhle, aby se k tomu dostala. Ten moloch Evropské unie, to není perpetuum mobile, přesto je něčím neustále poháněný. Přesto se ty jednotlivé státy neustále podrobují čím dál tím většímu diktátu a nátlaku. Klasická věc, ať někdo souhlasí nebo nesouhlasí s kouřením, je, že naprostý zákaz kouření v restauracích prošel v Itálii a ve Francii. To je naprosto absurdní záležitost vzhledem k mentalitě a zvykům těchto národů. Proto se chci zeptat, jestliže to není perpetuum mobile, není to tak, že ne, že se Německo může identifikovat s tou Evropou jako se svou vlastí, není to tak, že Německo, hledám příčinu, Německo chce realizovat to, co se mu realizovat nepodařilo, potřebuje Německo Evropskou unii, potřebují Spojené státy americké Evropskou unii, potřebuje někdo jiný Evropskou unii na to, aby se z Evropanů stalo to stádo ovládané, které už bohužel z valné části, kterým už bohužel z valné části je. Děkuji.
I think there's absolutely no doubt that Germany, or German politicians, approached the European Union with a geopolitical agenda. I mentioned in my talk that they drew up a plan before the Berlin Wall had even fallen to create a kind of supranational superstructure to replace the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And naturally, they put themselves at the center of it. This plan was effectively the euro. And 20 years on, we can see that they are at the center of it. It's indisputably the case, everybody recognizes it, that Germany decides what happens in the eurozone. I think, though, that, and I very much agree with you in your question when you say that there is a paradoxical German, there's a paradoxical German sense of superiority, because the Germans think we know more than anybody else how bad nationalism is, so we are therefore the best Europeans because we have been so bad in the past. But it's like anything really in politics, isn't it? Politics, after all, is a balance of competing interests. And on the one hand, you have the German political class with its own preoccupations and its own ideological assumptions. And together with them, you have German big business, the makers of the BMWs and the Mercedes, the makers of companies like Siemens, all the big companies that obviously benefit from the Eurozone and whose export capacity is favoured by it. You have that on the one hand, and then, as we are increasingly seeing within German politics itself, you of course have the famous Mittelstand, the famous small and medium-sized enterprises, and above all the German taxpayer. And right now, there is a big tension between these two groups. The taxpayer, as everybody knows, is not interested in paying endlessly into the euro black hole, into the black hole of sovereign debt in the eurozone. So there will be, I think, a rebalancing of this domination of pro-European project. We organised a conference in Berlin on Saturday, a big conference. There were 600 people there. We had former ministers, former German ministers. We had diplomats, professors, other experts. And it was probably the first time, I think, that in Germany the notion of sovereignty, of national sovereignty, had been openly discussed. But if you read the German press, you will find daily attacks on the euro, daily attacks on it. Germany is going through a very strongly Eurosceptic stage at the moment. Public opinion in Germany is very hostile to the euro project, and it remains to be seen how far the government will be allowed to go by public opinion in these endless bailouts, which will obviously cost us so much money. So ultimately, I think that while, yes, there was a geopolitical plan, and I wrote about it in The Tainted Source, like anything in international relations and in diplomacy, nothing is permanent. There will always be something that will come along, and in this case, we can see in Germany itself, in the central power of Europe, the decisive power of Europe, we can see a lot of tension building up at the moment.
Pardon, můžeš se zeptat za mě, prostě jenom, abych vlastně tam nechodil. Tak já tam budu.
Musím ještě před touto doplňkovou otázkou říct, že už je poslední, protože čas už nás tlačí, takže už to nemusí.
Já jsem ještě chtěla k tomu doplnit, protože tam je opravdu ten paradox, že Němci jako takoví, daňoví poplatníci nebo občané, jsou samozřejmě už tvrdě proti Evropské unii, protože to jde vše z jejich kapes. Já jsem se možná nevyjádřila tak úplně přesně, jak je možné, že ta Evropská unie opravdu se chová jako perpetuum mobile, které ale neexistuje. Čili jestliže buď Německo to chtělo nějak a nevyšlo to, anebo to tak není. Pak tedy, kdo potřebuje to Evropskou unii? Já jsem se ptala, jestli Německo chce Evropskou unii, nebo chtějí to snad Spojené státy. Je pro Spojené státy dobrá Evropská unie? Pokud není ani pro Spojené státy, pro koho je dobrá? Protože pro občany jednotlivých států v Evropské unii určitě dobrá není. Proto se ptám, kde se bere to perpetuum mobile. Děkuji.
But I think I've answered it, surely. I mean, I think that there are quite simply financial interests driving. You ask me, do the United States, do they want this, does Germany want this? In a way, that's not the right way of asking the question, precisely because we are moving into a post-national world in which policy is the hostage of powerful lobbies. That's the problem. If states reasoned in geopolitical terms, maybe we would be in a better situation. I think there has been an excessive movement towards globalization because it favors the interest groups that I mentioned in an earlier answer. And of course I don't think it's good for Germany as a state, or as you say in your question, for the citizens of the European Union, any more than I think the process of globalization generally is good for those people. I think on the contrary that it has led to a centralization of capital, to disindustrialization, to huge migratory flows, to imbalances at the international level, to a whole series of processes which I think should be stopped. I think that economies should concentrate more on national priorities. States should look after their national citizens, because after all, those are the people who pay their taxes and those are the people who elected them. But it's not really a secret who benefits from these processes.
Before we close the debate with the final applause, let me remind ourselves that we are close to the Advent season, and the Christmas is around the corner, although the forces of revolution would rather call it winter season, or it's our old good Christmas. So it would be pity to visit Prague in this particular time of the year without befriending the infant of Prague. So, John, please let me give you a small gift. Were you there? The infant of Prague. Okay, so thank you very much once again for coming for your talk, and thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Účast, za mnoho dotazů a těším se zase někdy brzy. Na viděnou, na shledanou a na